Welcome to another episode of Monster Monday from the Ready to Die channel. This series explores the design of a creature I have built for Pathfinder 2nd Edition. The stat block for this creature can be found over on the Monster Monday blog, as well as the Twitter and Discord, all of which are linked below. This week is going to be a little different, because one of my beloved baby brothers came to me and asked me to make a monster solely based on some art. This art comes from Legends of Runeterra, and is known as the amalgamation of vile rites. But the creature I have made for this week is the Ethereal Terror. Much like the Ether Spider, this monster is a native of the Ethereal plane, where it serves as an apex predator. Somewhat surprisingly, the Ethereal Terror doesn't actually care that much about the material plane, and prefers to stay on its home plane, where it happily hunts, haunts, and ghosts. It favors a strange type of prey, which unfortunately for everybody else, isn't entirely common. So, when the Scoreman of Ghosts runs out of its food, the Terror reluctantly turns to the material plane and finds victims to stalk and torment, intentionally inflicting pain and misery before delivering a brutal death. But this sadism isn't without purpose. This agony is done with the intent of creating the feelings of injustice that lead to the formation of a ghost. Essentially, the Ethereal Terror plagues the material plane only to prepare its food on the ethereal plane, and I'm actually very happy with how I integrated those concepts into this creature's design. Before we get into that part of it though, we're going to discuss some of the more basic stuff. For example, I wanted to avoid making the Ethereal Terror an undead. As much as I love the creature type, it's a bit of an overpopulated one, even, or maybe especially, among my own creations. Therefore, it is an aberration that resides upon the ethereal plane, lending to the use of the ethereal trait as well. I wanted to stick with the idea of this creature being an apex predator in its home plane, and level 13 felt like a good placement for that. Despite its bulk and size, I designed the Terror with a high dexterity, because I wanted to play into the more spindly limbs it has, make it a little bit more nimble. Almost spidery in its movements, though I'm loath to use that descriptor when there's already an ether spider. However, its strength isn't very far behind its dexterity, being closer to a high value rather than moderate, which is instead reserved for its constitution and wisdom. The former is due to its connection to the ethereal plane, making it not all quite there, physically, while the latter is based on the idea of it serving as a hunter on its own plane, which also lends to the moderate to high perception it uses when hunting ghosts and specters. It is armed with an admirable array of skills, with athletics being the most prominent at a high bonus, as grappling is a considerable component of this critter's kit. It wants enemies to be in a state of turmoil when they die, and uses a moderate intimidation to help inflict that. It has low occultism from its habit of hunting spirits, as well as stealth to better serve as a hunter, though it mostly uses this against ghosts. When it wants to hide from creatures on the physical plane, it just slides back into the ethereal plane. Defensively, the Ethereal Terror is kind of in a weird spot. It's nimble and agile, but it isn't exactly a small target. Ultimately, I played into the ability scores I designed it with. It has a high armor class based on its dexterity, and I also like the idea that sometimes it isn't always where it appears to be, maybe that it has the occasional phantom limb that its foes might mistakenly swing at. Meanwhile, it has hit points between low and moderate, but favoring the former, which is in part due to its moderate constitution, but also because the Ethereal Terror has some ways to play it super safe. Its reflex uses a high value, still based on its dexterity, and then has a moderate will, which plays into its moderate wisdom, and helps make it more resilient to the frightful moan ability found on many ghosts. A low fortitude rounds out its saving throws because again, this creature is tied to a realm that is somewhat lacking in physicality. On the topic of physicality, we're ready to move into discussion of the Terror's tactics. I think I may need to diversify attack bonuses sometimes because I've definitely noticed a trend where strikes I make all use the same bonus, and that is the case here as well, where they both use a moderate attack bonus. But I always feel like the traits better serve as a balancing factor or a differentiating factor. For example, its claws have the agile trait, while dealing moderate damage, but its jaws lack that trait and have slightly shorter reach, but deal high damage. Both of these attacks come with improved grab, which was mostly informed by the art I used for this creature, and something that fed heavily into other aspects of its kit. Now, I built the Ethereal Terror with a suite of specialized powers, but there's a few more basic ones to discuss before we get to them. We'll start with some of the more boring options, though maybe I'm being a little harsh on them. Carry Off does provide some fun opportunities to the Terror, it's just not a new ability. It can be found on the Gogateth, which is actually a creature that I was very worried about building too similarly to when designing the Ethereal Terror. It was actually remembering the design and the concept of the Gogateth that led me into building the Terror as an ethereal creature, as exploring the idea of it inhabiting a different plane and being an apex predator there really helped distinguish it. And to better aid it in its efforts in hunting around its home, it has Ghostly Grasp. This falls into what I would call a housekeeping ability, where it's mostly about enabling the functionality of the creature. In this case, the ability probably won't ever come up against players, but it does allow the terror to interact with the ghosts that it usually hunts for. From there, we'll move into the activated abilities, opening up with a few more standard options. Swallow Hole itself is nothing new, but the terror does deal bludgeoning and then spirit damage with it, the latter representing the half-formed spirits within it trying to tear at the fresh soul. Then there's Trample, which uses a high DC reflex save, but in addition to the normal effects of this action, creatures that critically fail their save against it get caught up in one of its many limbs. This didn't happen in the test, but it seemed like a fun ability that worked with its art more than the general concept I developed. It also came as a suggestion from my little brother that wanted me to use this art to begin with, and was definitely something I wanted to include. Ethereal Step should probably be counted as one of its more unique abilities, but this is almost word for word taken from the Aether Spider. The biggest difference is likely the limitation regarding creatures it has swallowed, which I primarily included to prevent the terror from devouring a PC and then just vanishing on the party, preventing them from having a chance at saving their friend. However, with those out of the way, we can start looking at some of its more fun options, such as Inject Spirit. This is a concept that I toyed with designing as a poison of some sort, but it ended up working nicely as its own sort of status. And I felt that I wanted to have it be an action cost, since it is able to inflict a minute-long confused state with a high DC will save. Now, like the paralysis of a ghoul, this DC does go down at the end of each of the victim's turns, which balances out a bit. But there is another reason beyond that. You know its Ethereal Step? It can potentially afflict an enemy, say perhaps a barbarian, with this confusion, and then just step to another plane where it can't be targeted by them, forcing them to attack their party. And that can get dangerous. Alternatively, the terror can attempt to siphon soul against a creature it has in its fangs. This has some basis in power attack, vicious swing with the extra damage, but it also turns all this damage into spirit damage, which may end up bypassing some resistances, or do nothing at all. More menacingly, this has the chance of inflicting the Doomed condition with a high DC, a condition that can result in an instant death. Now this is somewhat balanced by the terror needing a creature grab to inflict this effect, and I admit that isn't super hard with its improved grab, but that will slow it down a bit, and hopefully keep this ability from being too oppressive. Finally, the terror has the Startling Appearance reaction, which triggers when it uses its Ethereal Step reaction. There was an idea I was cooking at one point to make an aura that generates a sense of unease about the terror, an idea that I think could work and have some use, but I am a fan of making use of reactions. This is yet another high DC will save, but for what it's worth, the creature does target the reflex save of creatures with Swallow Hole and Trample, while its grappling does go against Fortitude, meaning it has a chance to target all three saves. Anyway, this particular ability targets will, and then lets enemies get a better save against it. I considered having this be one of those effects where creatures are then immune for 24 hours, however I feel like the threat of the Ethereal Terror shouldn't fade. It is a menace, it is a threat, and if you can't see it, something bad is probably happening. But with those three abilities covered, you may notice some commonalities. The existence of torturous conditions, such as Frightened, Confused, and Doomed. This is all based on the idea that creatures suffering from these conditions are, maybe not mechanically, but flavor-wise, more likely to become a ghost upon dying, trapped in their terror or the throes of uncontrollable rage. It's minor, and I'm not entirely certain that it comes across, but it's a concept that I'm a big fan of, and one that I wanted to include, even if it wasn't super obvious. Though with that all said, we have covered the Ethereal Terror. This grotesque Gorman grants grisly graves to guardians to gain greater ghastly goods, greedily grabbing and gruesomely gobbling up ghosts galore. The Ethereal Terror is a fantastic random encounter creature, though it might not be random on its part. The terror could be stalking its prey for days before it decides to spring upon them. Alternatively, the heroes may be hired to guard an exorcist after his colleagues have been gruesomely and mysteriously slain, meeting their ends at the many hands of an Ethereal Terror that despises them for putting its mules to rest. Let me know what you think of this creature and what others you would like to see in a comment. If you want to see other monsters I've done, or even the stat blocks and other versions of this monster, check out the Monster Monday blog or Twitter, linked below. Thanks for watching, and have a monstrous Monday. Hey, just a quick mention before I go. With the help of Eldritch Osiris Games, we published Volume 4 of Monday Monsters this week. Wyrms and Wondrous works as a small collection of monsters, in this case dragons and constructs, that I've made. and that we sell to generate funding for future original monsters, with the intent of one day releasing a full book. Check it out if you want to support the channel and our future endeavors.